faculty member at Australian National University, where I visited just a few weeks ago. So welcome. This important lecture couldn't take place without the help of many individuals, including the planning committee, Dr. David Kenley, Kanthi Narukonda, Vicky Johnson, I see you up there, and Jason Mixon. And thanks also to Dr. David Gillian for his assistance. I'd also like to thank the army of people who provide support for this event, including Gail Cole and the Sodexo team who provided the food service for you, Donna Forbush and Bryn Hart with the events and facilities team, and Miranda Morris in the President's office, Tyler Steele and Nolan Moser in ITS, our technology organization, and Andrew Song and the marketing team. So a lot of people behind the scenes have been working for quite some time to bring us this lecture today. So thanks to all of you for your efforts that have brought us to this evening. Could we have a round of applause for everyone to stand up? Thank you. So the purpose of tonight's event is really quite simple. At Dakota State, we talk a lot about cyber, and I mean that in the original historical meaning of the term, coined in 1948, 1950, 51 by Norbert Wiener, which means everything to do with computers and data processing and everything that's become in this day and age. But in order for us to fully understand the impacts of these technologies, we have to grasp not only the technical aspects, not just the technology aspects, but why they function and how they function. And I always say, technologies, no matter how well they're designed and developed and deployed, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're implemented and used in context, in user context, in social context, in cultural context. And that's important for us to understand, because if you just think only about the technology, you're not going to sort of understand why it's there, why it's that technology, what it was built from, what were the ideas that inspired it, what are the ideas that inspire use that wasn't intended originally, because people always think about certain functions, and it's when you really start taking technology and using it for your own purpose, new and creative aspects start to come out. So it's important for us to explore the potential good and potential harm that any emerging technology can unleash on society. So that's the purpose of our history and ethics forums, to provide a balance to our knowledge so that we can better determine how to develop policies, how to develop accountability mechanisms, how to watch what's going on and be vocal and try and ensure that we don't use technologies to bring harm, but we try to do the maximum good for society. That's sort of the original intent of this. So I want to thank all members of the committee, and now it's my great pleasure. Well, actually I have one more thing, but tonight's speaker will offer us a glance at one of those examples with signals intelligence. And those of you in cybersecurity know what signals intelligence is. And it's signals across communication lines. Even Morse code would be signal. The listening to Morse code would be the signals intelligence and making sense of it. And but Dr. Blaxland is going to bring a global context to this topic, showing how threads of European, British, and American technological innovation in the area of signals intelligence came together in Australia in 1942 during the War of the Pacific, part of World War II, and how this arrangement has persisted in the decades since and actually led us to be in the situation we are at DSU in terms of our relationships with certain federal agencies. So it's an interesting story. It's understanding the history of how this all came about and understanding what that means in the broader context of society. That's very, very important. So I hope all the students here will take this to heart and recognize that whenever you meet something that's apparently new, take a look and see if it's really new and see what's the history of all of that? How did that evolve? It's why I often talk about the history of this institution. We didn't just suddenly become what we are today. It happened for a reason in a number of ways because decisions that people made. So that's my lecture for the moment, and it's already too long. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. David Kenley to introduce our speaker for tonight. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor John Blaxland. Professor Blaxland is a distinguished scholar, historian, and former military officer whose career and contributions have significantly shaped our understanding of intelligence, security, and military history in Australia and beyond. Professor Blaxland currently serves as Director of the Australian National University North American Liaison Office and Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies. His work is focused on analyzing and addressing the complexities of modern defense and international relations, making him a trusted voice on national security matters in both academic and public spheres. He has served in various leadership roles in the Australian Army and has extensive experience in defense analysis both within Australia and internationally, including work with the Department of Defense and strategic deployments in Southeast Asia. And we've been talking about Southeast Asia today, and that's a common interest of ours. In addition to his military and academic careers, Professor Blaxland is a prolific writer. His publications include several books on Australia's military history and intelligence, such as The Australian Army from Whitlam to Howard and The Secret Cold War, as well as numerous articles and reports on defense policy and regional security issues in the Indo-Pacific. This afternoon he said, "Can I borrow your office for a bit?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." He sat down, and within an hour he came out and he said, "Thanks, I just wrote an editorial for The Guardian about the presidential elections and U.S.-Australian relations." I'm like, wow, I got to get a computer like that. That's awesome. Through his writing and research, he has greatly contributed to public debates and policy discussions around intelligence, espionage, and national security. On a personal note, John and I have been communicating now for a few months, planning tonight's event, and it's been wonderful to get to know him. I found out that last night he kind of stumbled into a hotel in downtown Sioux Falls. It turned out to be an election party, and the next thing I know, on social media, there's pictures of John with Senator Thune and Congressman Johnson and Miles Beacom, and I thought, this guy knows how to get around. He's not only an insightful conversationalist, but also, as they say in Australia, a good mate. Tonight, Professor Blaxland brings his unique perspective on the role of ethics and history in contemporary intelligence. His insights promise to provide us with both historical depth and practical understanding as we consider the moral and ethical implications of security in today's world. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor John Blaxland.
Thank you, David. Well, those words are way too kind, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to clearly disappoint you because I'm not sure I can possibly live up to expectations now. Look, you're just going to have to bear with me for a little while, but I'll give it my best shot, and I'll see how I go. Okay. Firstly, I am a pontificating professor, as David said. I do like to write. I can't help myself. My wife asked me, "John, why do you keep doing this?" And I said, "Look, Jude, I don't really know. I just keep wanting to do it." So here we are. This is the book we're going to be talking about essentially tonight, Revealing Secrets, An Unofficial History of Australian Signals Intelligence and the Advent of Cyber, which I had a lot of fun working on. This is an outline on it. And I was originally criticised about focusing on early cryptology. And I have to qualify this. I did this with my great colleague Claire Bergen, who was initially my research assistant, but then the project got a little bit derailed and she helped me put it back together and helped me write the last few chapters. So a very significant contribution from Claire. But we wanted to include early cryptology to give a bit of the historical context of how SIGINT emerges. And then we went through the 20th century explaining it. But it's useful to put a bit of ancient cryptology into context because most people don't quite appreciate this, but the whole idea of cryptology isn't just something that we came up with in the 20th century. It goes right back. The idea of secrecy. And in the West, we had this idea of the scutali, the idea of this strip of leather that you would wrap around the field marshal's baton, and that would only by wrapping it around that you could then read the message, right? So nowadays, the legacy of that is that pompous British and sometimes Australian generals walk around with baton, a baton to which is symbolic of the past significance of this commander being the person who would get the message. Julius Caesar came up with this idea of passing messages to circumvent people who would subsequently betray him, obviously. This idea of a monoalphabetic substitution cipher. That is, that you get, so like the letters A, B, and C, you swap them with D, E, and F. It was a pretty simple monoalphabetic substitution, but effective in the short term, right? And that was then became more widely adopted. In the East, we say in the East, I'm talking very generically here in the East, Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese strategy, talked about the use of spies. He who knows the enemy and himself will never in 100 years of battles be at risk. Of course, Al-Kindi, this famous Arab Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, discovered the frequency principle, which is a very important one for cryptography. The idea of actually picking out which letters have the greatest frequency of use. And in English and French, it's T and E, right? These are the letters that are almost invariably used. So you can actually, by a bit of a reduction, and you can pick out which of the letters are going to be most frequent, and then you can do some pattern analysis and work it out. And there's in Chinese tradition, there's the jiaozi, the carried picture, the note, and the cipher code all in the message, which is very significant as well. And that was actually replicated in the Beijing Olympics. In the Elizabethan era, Sir Francis Walsingham uncovered the Babington plot, and this was a mono-alphabetic substitution cipher with Mary Queen of Scots, was communicating with Babington, and Sir Francis Walsingham unpicked the message, and of course, Britain remained a Protestant country. It didn't revert to Catholicism, and the rest is history. But so the consequence of cryptography and deciphering messages incredibly profound if you know what you're looking for. In European cryptology, we see the idea of the frequency principle picked up, and the idea of cipher disks emerges. This idea of polyalphabetic substitution. So you saw Julius Caesar had the monoalphabetic. When you put the numbers and letters around on a circle, you put multiple circles, you can do polyalphabetic substitution. And of course, this is exactly what happens with the German Enigma machine in the Second World War. This idea of multiple disks to hide the message. We see Cardinal Richelieu in France coming up with a cabinet noir, the black chamber, the first cryptanalytic agency, of course, replicated symbolically with no such agency, the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland, which is actually a black-looking chamber-like building. Spectacular kind of echo of Richelieu's cabinet noir. Interestingly, we write in the book about the Napoleonic Wars as well, because we don't think about the Napoleonic Wars as all that consequential for cryptography, except that when you think about how Napoleon was very cavalier about the skills of his enemies in hiding and deciphering messages themselves. And the Duke of Wellington, with his own corps of guides, having his experience from being in the colonies in India, employed George Scavel, who broke the French codes, applying the frequency principle, which gave the Duke of Wellington significant advantage for the crucial Battle of Salamanca in Spain in July 1812. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander I has his own cabinet noir, and Napoleon's off fighting, trying to capture Russia. He underestimates Russia's ability to break French ciphers, which is compounded by Napoleon's own generals' reluctance to give him bad news, and the fact that Napoleon is focused more on what's going on in Paris than what's happening ahead of him on the battlefield. And of course, we know the rest is history there as well. So interestingly though, late 18th and into the 19th century, significant technological advances transform the equation. We see Benjamin Franklin with his electricity experiment in 1752, Alexandra Volta coming up with the electric battery, Faraday with the electric motor, Samuel Morse with his code, the telegraphy, which is actually applied in battle, in the War of Crimea, and of course in the US Civil War in the 1850s and 1860s. Heinrich Hertz with the electronic wave propagation, and Marconi with the wireless radio communication. At the very end of the 19th century, this idea of a radio, of a wireless radio transmission, it's transforming the equation. Absolutely game changer in terms of what you can communicate, how you can communicate, and how you can eavesdrop. Really cool. So we see in the Australian context, at the start of the First World War, we have a convoy of troops going to fight in the Middle East, thinking they're going to go to Europe, but they get stopped at Egypt to then fight at the Battle of Gallipoli in the Dardanelles in what's modern-day Turkey. But on the way, they encounter through signals intercept, they figure out there's a German raider, SMS Emden, in and around Australian territory. And so HMAS Sydney is diverted to go and track down the Emden, knowing that HMAS Sydney has bigger, more powerful guns than SMS Emden. And of course, so that's a picture of the Emden beached and done for on the AUKUS Islands in what is now Australian territory, then it was British territory. In the Second World War, so the First World War, not terribly sophisticated British Australian signals intelligence. We basically left it to the Brits largely, to the French and to a certain extent the Americans. By the Second World War, there's a growing realisation that we actually need national SIGINT capabilities. So Commander Rupert Cocky Long, pictured there on the left, starts a SIGINT agency for the Royal Australian Navy. And Lieutenant General Squires, who's actually a British officer, seconded to the Australian Army to help us at the start of the war, strongly advocates to the Australian government that they should have an Army SIGINT agency as well. So these guys are progenitors of a significant muscling up, if you like, of Australian SIGINT enterprise. Of course, we leverage off, and this is something that isn't often given credit to, but my colleague Claire Bergen really wanted us to, she had been a diplomat in Poland, and she appreciated the work of the Poles. So the Poles are recognised here, who made an outsized influence on British and indirectly Allied SIGINT through the work of these three Polish gentlemen who actually unpicked the Enigma, and they developed this bomber, this machine that could actually electromagnetically decode the coded messages from the Enigma machine. There you see a picture of the Enigma on the right. See the three wheels, the three spinning wheels. That's the polyalphabetic substitution electromechanical machines. That over the course of the war, they'd add a fourth wheel and then a fifth wheel, thinking they will stay ahead. The Allies can't possibly break it, can they? And of course, with people like Alan Turing and the bomb machine, they could. But interestingly, what they did was they needed to unpick the thread at the start before they could feed it into the machine and reduce the prospect of coming up with false leads. So they would use probable opening phrases like Heil Hitler or greetings and salutations that would go with the standard message. They'd feed them in, and that would reduce the probability of failure that the machine could then work out, and they could quickly get ahead of the game, and a transformative effect. Now in Australia, with the Pacific War, we see a transformation, because up until the outbreak of the Pacific War, Australia's very much working with the British, with the Far Eastern Combined Bureau in Hong Kong and in Singapore. So we see, and also the University of Sydney code breaking group that the British general on loan had set up, had recommended being set up. Meanwhile, MacArthur and the Americans in the Philippines have Station Cast and Station 6, Station Cast being the Navy facility, Station 6 being the Army. And of course, they didn't talk to each other very much back then. But then when they retreat, so MacArthur, who is, let me just say, MacArthur is, up in the Philippines. It's not showing very well, but you can see up in the division, in the space there on the map, the Philippine Islands. He retreats from the Philippines to Australia. you wonder, why is that line there in the middle of the map between Southwest Pacific area and Pacific Ocean area? Partly because MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz hated each other's guts, so they couldn't collaborate, so they had to split the Pacific between them. And as a result, the US Marines and US Navy fight the Battle of Guadalcanal, which is just over the right-hand side of that line in the Solomon Islands, and Australia with MacArthur fight in Dakota and Bougainville and places like that. But out of this emerges these three bodies. Frumel on the picture, on the left, on the right-hand side of that picture, Frumel, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, Central Bureau. What the blazes is a Central Bureau. You know, it's a nondescript name to deflect attention from its real purpose, which is eavesdropping, it's signals intelligence, right? And the third one, D Special Section. Well, what on earth is that? Diplomatic Special Section. So unpicking diplomatic cables, which is a very ungentlemanly thing to do, remember? As Stimson would remind us, gentlemen don't read each other's mail, do they? Surely not. Right? But we see here Abe Sinkov, this really incredibly bright American cryptographer, is assigned to come to Australia to work with Central Bureau. Eric Nave, this polymath who's a Japanese linguist and a very capable mathematician, who's breaking the Imperial Japanese Navy Code. These guys collaborate to establish this signals intelligence architecture in Australia. So you see in that red box these intelligence bodies that emerged in the Second World War under General MacArthur as part of the Southwest Pacific area that are combined Australian-American in a way that was unimaginable prior to 1942. So we see from 42 to 45 this deep, trusted collaboration across the Allied Intelligence Bureau, Translator Interpreter Service, Australian Allied Geographical Service, Central Bureau, Section 22. Section 22, what on earth is that? Electronic intelligence, radars, right? ELINT, right? Very cool stuff. Capitalizing on what's happening on the right-hand side of the diagram, the deployed forces collecting information, reporting back on what they're hearing and seeing, and then all being collated and put together to give General MacArthur and his staff key information to make effective decisions for what to do next in the war. In the meantime, Mrs. Florence Vallant Mackenzie, she's the first lady in Australia to get electrical engineering qualifications. She sets a radio and Morse training school in Australia to train women in advance of the Japanese onslaught to get ready, mindful that she was very prescient. She knew that there was a real need to get ready. And sure enough, by the time the war's broken out in the Pacific, this is a picture of Frumel, the code room, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. These women were doing critical work that up until this point, they'd never been given credit for being able to do. Incredible. And it's a transformative work that they didn't get credit for decades later. It's one of the reasons why Claire and I wanted to give them due deference. And of course, that photo is on the cover of the book. Central Bureau Brisbane and staff you pictured here, a lot going on in that space with decryption, translation, reporting, analysis, and dissemination of signals intelligence reports that had to get out quickly, combining reports that were collected from deployed elements forward and the HF radios back that were able to combine to provide a picture that was unconstructable elsewhere, right? And there were some significant figures. Booth, Sanford and Treweek are three Australian officers who are pictured in the middle there, who were instrumental in establishing this, and they were the key guys who helped the transition at the end of the war to make up an Australian body afterwards. The Sagaba and the Sig Sally, the Sagaba, the pictured on the left there, is a machine not that dissimilar to the German Enigma machine with polyalphabetic substitution rotor wheels. So electromechanical encryption device, but it was much more automated than the German one. And the one pictured on the right there is the Sig Sally, which is a voice encryption device. Incredible. You see that now, of course, you can do that on a little box in your phone in your pocket. But back in 1943, 44, it took a whole room. That's how it worked. This is electromechanical computing, early days. Eat your heart out. Of course, the Battle of the Coral Sea, just off the coast of Queensland, was about the Japanese fleet trying to get around and capture Port Moresby. to stage a coup de main, if you like, and quickly seize it, but they didn't partly because of SIGINT. We intercepted the Japanese messages about the fleet movement, and while it was seen on one level to be a bit of a stalemate and not very successful because of the sinking of several US naval ships, the bottom line was that it was a strategic victory because it stopped the Japanese assault on Port Moresby. Battle of Midway, similarly, who's seen the movie Midway? Anyone seen the movie Midway? It's a cracker, isn't it? It's a really good movie. And SIGINT gets a fair billing in the movie. The SIGINT guys and girls get, I think there's some girls mentioned in there, but it's really terrific story. But what isn't mentioned is the fact that it's Frumel and FRUPAC, Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, collaborating with Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. Why? Because the antenna farms in Victoria are perfectly positioned to get the bouncing HF waves off the ionosphere that you can't get in Hawaii, you can't get in London, but you can get them in Victoria, in southern Australia. So this idea of collaboration, of cross-pollination, of swapping notes and collaborating, deep, top secret, trusted collaboration is the groundswell, the background noise, if you like, to the post-war architecture that emerges. And that's the context. So the successes here, the trusted collaboration is that context. We see the Canadians in the mix too. In 1945, the first Canadian Special Wireless Group is assigned to Australia. They offer their services to the Brits, and the Brits say, look, actually, you're probably better off going to help the Aussies, right? I did my PhD comparing Canada and Australia in a book called Strategic Cousins. I'd not heard of this, and subsequently I got a visit to Leitrim, the Canadian Forces SIGINT base, just outside Ottawa, and the hall is lined with photos of Canadians in Australia. I'm thinking, what's going on here? How come I didn't know about this? And sure enough, there was this wonderful story of the first Canadian Special Wireless Group operating in Australia, part of this, what became now known, back then in very hushed tones, the Five Eyes, right? The idea of Australia, Canada, UK, US, New Zealand, eyes only. 5 eyes only, abbreviated to 5 eyes. So quite extraordinary. There we have that architecture I talked about in the box from the Second World War. Now MacArthur packed up his bongos and he left to Japan in 1944-45. And Australia was a little bit bereft because his focus was on Japan. He said, look, he was actually fairly transactional about it. He was not really, he didn't see it as an alliance. He saw it as a temporary fix to beat Japan. But over time, clearly that sentiment shifted. Now, at the end of the war, there was a hiatus. What are we going to do? Do we really need this architecture? We didn't have it before World War II. Are we going to have it now? And of course, the Cold War kicks in, and all of a sudden, the architecture that's on the right-hand side of the picture emerges. This intelligence architecture across a range of domains, but including the SIGINT one near the bottom there, which is the Defence Signals Bureau. Now, this is not AT&T, okay? This is not about fixing your phone. This is eavesdropping, right? This is signals intelligence. So once again, designed to deflect attention from its real purpose of listening in. Headphones on, playing with the dial, tweaking the codes, tweaking the frequency, translating, interpreting, analysing, reporting. Extraordinary that precedent of the Second World War sets the path for the post-war architecture that emerges. So in Australia's case, we see these organisations emerge that lead to what's in the 21st century known as the National Intelligence Community, the NIC in Australia's context. 10 agencies in that space, headed by the Office of National Intelligence, like the ODNI of the United States, if you like, with a coordinating function for the intelligence function across the Australian government. That is very much a legacy of the Second World War. Along the way, Australia went to the Vietnam War, and we were talking about aerial SIGINT before, weren't we, Mary? And of course, this is the airborne radio direction finding that Australia developed with our Defence Science and Technology Group in Australia, designed to fly in a straight line and listen and ping to direction find and geolocate the Viet Cong radio transmissions. Very effective. So these guys in this Cessna, it was an innocuous looking plane flying in a straight line, designed to kind of listen in without being too conspicuous to enemy communications that would then be used to vector in Australian forces to go and find them. And very successfully for a number of years there. By the end of our time, by the province that Australia had been assigned, there was very little action going on actually. So we ended up, the last couple of years of the war, fighting in provinces outside of the principal province because there was little left to do. Along the way, I talked about FRUMEL, Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. After the Second World War, this organisation called the Royal Australian Navy Tactical Electronic Warfare Support Squadron emerges. And this guy, James Armstrong, who's actually a Royal Navy transferee, is instrumental in really establishing Ranchus as a viable entity with air and sea platform EW. Very significant contributor to Australia's contribution to the Five Eyes arrangement, in fact. It came out at the time of the Moonraker. He was instrumental around about the time James Bond and the Moonraker movie came out. And this guy was a Commander James Armstrong, right? No, almost James Bond, but kind of had this reputation as being Bond-like. He's certainly very debonair and had a certain je ne sais quoi, if I can use that term, which most Australians, don't know. But anyway, did I say that? Did I say that out loud? That was the inner voice, John. Shush, shush. Of course, we have what I call the suitable piece of real estate. I say that it's riffing off the name of a book by one of my mentors, Professor Desmond Ball, the late Professor Des Ball, who wrote about signals intelligence in Australia, and he talked about Pine Gap. You mentioned Pine Gap, John. This is a very, very secret base for a long, long time. It was talked about in hushed tones, and it is amazing. All right, it is amazing. If you ever get a chance to go, grab it. It's very cool place to go. But anyway, it's in the middle of Australia, and it is right in the footprint of some amazing geostationary satellites that have a footprint over the whole of the Eurasian landmass. So what possible benefit could there be in being able to hoover up the information in that space? Well, enormous, right? Enormous benefit for the United States and for Australia. That place is 50% operated by Australians, 50% by Americans. There is no place like it on the planet. It is unique, and it is part of what the pièce de résistance, if I can use another French term, the jewel in the crown, suitable piece of real estate. It is seriously cool piece of real estate. And there are lots of people who don't know enough about it, who I would contend who want to see it closed down, but successive governments, when they're briefed in on it, say, no, we're not touching that, we're keeping that. That's really good. Right. Now, along the way, we start going through what I call a Copernican revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, or the digital revolution. So we've gone from electromechanical computers with analog radio transmissions and the like, and telegraphy, to the introduction of ones and zeros. This is what I call the Copernican revolution. Why? Because out of this space, not only do you get these very cool encrypted digital communications devices emerging, like the Stu 2 Bravo pictured on the left, and the Australian Speakeasy, which is our voice encryption device from the 1980s, 90s. We see the deployed SIGINT support facility, a suitcase device capable of doing the kind of work that required, a factory's worth of technology in the Second World War. And pictured there on the right, the first Cray computer introduced in Australia. It's American technology that's shared with Australia on a trusted basis, noting that back in 1943, we get the first IBM electromechanical computers introduced. So the SIGINT domain is where the computing excellence, the hearth of computing intellectual capability is found in Australia. And so when the digital revolution takes place, this is where you've spawned kind of computing excellence that is unmatched elsewhere in the country, tapping into the trusted collaboration with the United States, the United Kingdom, as well as Canada and New Zealand. It's unprecedented, it's unparalleled in history. There is no network like it that's ever been experienced in humankind. It's phenomenal, right? And as I say, with the digital revolution, we see I remember the debate when we were going off HF, people thinking, what are we going to do? People are stopping to use HF, right? Little did we realise the explosion of other technologies in the digital realm that would make us overwhelmed with sources of information to tap into. Now that generated some problems with, as you know, with the Snowden revelations over time, but the capability was extraordinary because all of these technologies were accessible and, of course, conversely required protection. So we see the emergence of the cyber domain for cyber security, for cyber offence, for cyber operations that was unimagined a generation before. All of this technology transformed the game, transformed the business, transformed the centrality of the SIGINT enterprise, the cyber security enterprise, not only as something that you hid behind a cover name like Central Bureau or the Defence Signals Bureau or the No Such Agency, right? But you actually declared your hand. So we have now the Australian Cyber Security Centre, right? We have a cyber czar. Why? Because these agencies now have a responsibility to the nation and to the broader community at large and to the shared network of friends and partners abroad to actually help defend, protect and respond to threats. Nowadays, it was very interesting, I was in a conversation with the Director General of one of the intelligence agencies in Australia, about which I wrote a couple of books a long time ago. And he said, John, back in the day, we used to have put bugs in people's houses. Now they just carry them in their pockets for us. You know? And sure enough, it's true. It's transformed the equation and it's transformed the business. In the Australian Signals Directorate, we have this program called Red Spice, which is about muscling up the cyber domain, recruiting more people, bringing more people into Australia, making more things happen to bolster resilience, generate effects, provide defence in the space, in intelligence and cyber, and in a range of enablers. A $9 to $10 billion program in Australian billion dollars. It's about $6 billion US. And along the way, we've seen, what was this very secretive body, the Defence Signals Bureau, would be renamed the Australian Signals Directorate with its own website. And here's a picture of it showing you the Essential 8. Why the Essential 8? Because we all need to be alert, aware and not alarmed at the scale of the challenge we face in a world that's gone from being web-enabled to web-dependent and in turn web-vulnerable. So in response, this body that was once very secretive and closed shop, full of introverted, hoodie-wearing, basement-dwelling geeks, right? All of a sudden needed to transform into a more extroverted, shopfront running, website fronting organisation to engage society, schools, universities, industry, government and more. And this is the list of 8: to patch applications, patch operating systems, to provide multi-factor authentication, to restrict administrative privileges, to provide control over applications that can operate on your systems, to restrict Microsoft Office macros so that they don't enable people to then abuse the system and get in and inveigle their way in, to harden the user applications and make sure that there are regular backups. They're all pretty Mickey Mouse kind of things, but they're actually easy to forget, right? They're really critical to the business. to our own personal, corporate and national and international safety and security. Now, all of this leads to what I wrote in this piece for Georgetown Journal of International Affairs a couple of months ago. So this is the context, if you like, of AUKUS. AUKUS, what the blazes are you talking about, John? AUKUS is the Australia, UK, US trilateral security agreement to share nuclear propulsion technology so that Australia can get nuclear propulsion submarines. A deal that's only been happened once before, where the Americans shared technology with the Brits, okay? Back in the 1950s. That doesn't happen without 82 years of top secret, intergenerational, trusted collaboration, manifested in the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Cyber Security Centre. That is the background noise that when this idea is put to Joe Biden, a couple of years back in 2021, outrageous idea of sharing nuclear propulsion technology with anybody, he thinks, yeah, that's not a bad idea, right? Because he gets it. And I'm pretty sure President Trump will get it as well. His advisors are indicating that that would be the case. So, when you look at the global security challenges, some of which we've talked about tonight on the SIGINT domain, they look different from down under, right? The world looks different. It's not the Mercator projection, but I'm sorry to disappoint you folks, the world is not flat, right? It's actually round, right? And when you spin it a certain way, you see this is what we call the Indo-Pacific. Australia, it's got a, people call it a bloody big moat, right? It's one of the reasons we have a small defence force, a boutique defence force, because we haven't felt the need for a big one. And for, when the unipolar moment was on, all we needed to do was plug in and play and support you guys doing what you guys did. That may well be changing. And one of the things I've done along the way, thinking about SIGINT but putting it in more and broader context, is this idea of a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, which looks at the internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. You don't need to worry about it now. You can Google it and download it if you're interested. But the bottom line is, and I showed this to my wife and I thought, wasn't I clever, right? How clever I was to do this SWOT analysis. And she said to me, John, so what? And I thought, oh, that's brutal. I thought I was all that pretty darn clever. Anyway, sure enough, I had to go back to the drawing board, dig a bit deeper, and that's when I came up, and I should have thought of this all along. I mean, I like pictures anyway. You can see, I like pictures, right? I'm a simple guy. I need pictures, right? So I came up with this idea of the Venn diagram. And when I look at the SWOT, the spectrum of challenges we face, we're looking at great power competition. We're dealing with looming environmental catastrophe and a spectrum of governance challenges, people smuggling, drug smuggling, civil war, corruption, terrorism, etc., right? All accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution, the Copernican revolution of the ones and zeros that have turned us from being web-enabled to web-dependent and in turn web-vulnerable. But who owns that space in the middle? What academic discipline, what jurisdiction, what government agency, what international body, what guru owns that? I don't know anyone who does. But we all have a bit role to play. But in understanding the broader context, we can think about SIGINT and cyber and see how it fits into the spectrum of challenges we face today. As I say, some people describe it as a polycrisis. I like to think of it in terms of that movie, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. The spectrum of global security challenges: economic, environmental, political, human, cyber, maritime, territorial, and homeland. What could possibly go wrong? Well, unfortunately, the list is long, right? But when we think about the connection between Australia and the United States, there are some commonalities that I think are worth dwelling on. And this is something we don't tend to think about too much. I mentioned it briefly in an interview I did this morning. Australia and the United States are continent-spanning, federal, bicameral, cosmopolitan, English-speaking, New World liberal constitutional democracies. There aren't too many in the world. We need to look out for each other. We need to be informed by that. And then there's the 5 key ties. One is the bilateral free trade agreement. 2 is the bilateral free trade agreement. Sorry, the ANZUS alliance, 1. 2 is the bilateral free trade agreement. 3 is the trilateral AUKUS pact. 4 is the quadrilateral Quad. And 5 is the Five Eyes. And of course, there's a range of other connections along the way listed there. It's multifold. But the point is that Australia and the United States, we actually we have more in common. We have more common interests and more common concerns than most of us even recognise. Now, in Australia, we're fixated on the United States. You guys dominate our media. I suspect it's not quite the case in reverse. Nonetheless, I'm hoping that you'll realise that the Pacific matters for America. We talked before about the Solomon Islands. You can see they're just to the northeast of Australia, to the right. Solomon Islands, where the Battle of Guadalcanal was fought in 1942, I mentioned. This is contested territory, ladies and gentlemen. There are sea cables in this space. There is political influence. There is corruption. There is looming environmental catastrophe. All of those bits of the Venn diagram are all at play. And the United States, most people forget, has an enormous footprint in the Pacific. Who knew, right? Who knew? The United States is a Pacific power. And it's good to wake up and remember that. I know it seems a long way away from South Dakota, but this is the United States. It's not a state of the United States. It is your interests writ large, which happen to overlap extensively with the land down under, from which I hail. So on that basis, and for that reason, amongst many others, I think some of you should come and study in Australia, right? Because firstly, we're barely monolingual like you guys, right? So barely speak one language, English, and we don't speak it very well, so you'll have to pardon me for that, right? We are world-class education. It's safe, it's a little bit exotic, and it's very friendly. And if you've got an American accent, Australians will love you. I'm just saying. Righto. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for humouring me. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Blaxland. I have a microphone, and I will walk around and share it with you so that when you ask your questions, we can all hear it. And I have a question, but I'm going to keep silent and let anyone else go first.
Go on, David, go first.
All right. I'll prime the pump, so to speak. Here in the United States, we tend to think of our allies being Canada, France, the UK. We don't tend to think about how important Australia is to this alliance. And yet this AUKUS agreement, which you've just mentioned, the sharing of nuclear technology with nuclear submarine technology with Australia, was not only extremely important in terms of U.S.-Australian relations, but it also kind of fractured U.S.-French relations. Some of our allies weren't thrilled with us cozying up to Australia. I just wanted to share that example with you and ask your insight on how does U.S.-Australian relations influence and impact relations with other countries, obviously China, but even places like France?
Yeah, so thank you, David. Great question. So, I think it's fair to say we mishandled the launching of AUKUS and the breaking of the contract with the French. We were entitled to break the contract, but the way we broke it was pretty sloppy and a bit embarrassing. And it just so happened that a few months later there was an election which saw a change of government, which provided a handy excuse for a political reset, both from France and Australia. And so the United States copped it a little bit, but indirectly. It was France's ire, its annoyance, was mostly channeled towards Australia, understandably, because it was mostly about Australia. Because we breached, it was a big contract with the French for them to make submarines for us. But they weren't going to be nuclear, they were going to be diesel-electric submarines. The problem is diesel-electrics don't work for Australia anymore. To go anywhere in Australia, even to go from Fremantle, the port where the submarines are based, to any other capital city, requires you to snort, to put up your funnel to recharge the batteries at least a dozen times. Each one of those now is a point of extreme vulnerability. Why? Because of almost saturation polar low Earth orbit satellites operated by China across Australia's space, coupled with 30 years of pattern analysis of where the submarines go and how they operate, coupled with artificial intelligence and drones, you're dead in the water. You can't hide. You pop up, you put that mask up, the snorkel up, the wake in the water is detectable. So pack up and go home or stay underwater. And the only way to stay underwater is nuclear propulsion. And we came to that slowly, and the politics around this of ScoMo and Bojo, as they say, talking to Joby, this idea, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister in Australia, Boris Johnson in the UK, and Joe Biden in the US, it seemed like some kind of concocted myth that they'd made up for purely political purposes. There's no question there's a political element to it, right? No question. But the bottom line is that the technical reality of it is that Australia hadn't really needed to go there. And we had to convince the United States that was work, and we co-opted the Brits to help us. And that's how it happened. And it came at the cost of the relationship with France. But today, you go back to that map, France is a Pacific power. You see there, right next to Australia, south of Solomon Islands, is France in the New Caledonia, and of course France further out in the Pacific territories, Tahiti and more. Right? France is an Indo-Pacific power. It's got territories in the Indian Ocean as well. So Australia, the US, and France, as well as New Zealand, actually, to be honest, need to get on. And the loss of the Scott Morrison government, replacement by the Albanese government in Australia, provided that opportunity for a reset, and the French grabbed it, and we've just re-signed a France, Australia, New Zealand arrangement for monitoring affairs and helping humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the South Pacific. So the French have swallowed their pride. They've taken the opportunity presented by Scott Morrison's defeat to re-engage Australia and let bygones be bygones. So I think by and large, there's no question there's a bit of resentment still there, but by and large, we're on good terms. Thank you.
Hi, my name is David. I wanted to ask, how many books have you written, and what keeps you motivated to keep writing on these topics? David,
thank you. Great question. So depending on how you count it, I've written about 15. And I get a topic, I get motivated to write about, and I get fired up. And I've been very lucky because I'm now a tenured prof at ANU, at the Australian National University. So I've got a considerable latitude, time and effort-wise to write. But as a young student, I remember when I was doing my honours thesis, I really got into my topic. I can get tunnel visioned. My wife says, points this out to me all the time, John, get out of your books, stop talking, come and talk to me, talk to the real world. I get a bit tunnel visioned. And when I'm on a book project, I get a bit obsessed, I confess, right? I'm a bit of a nerd. So that's part of goes with the territory. I then focus until I get it complete. And then, so what happened was with my honours thesis, I got a first class honours degree out of it, which was, yay, I was thrilled, right? And then I got it published, and that was just like, OMG, that is such a good feeling, right? The first publication. So it was a little monograph published by the ANU in Canberra, and that then opened the door. And then I got a bug. I thought, I want to keep writing. That was such a good feeling, right? I then offered my services to write a history of the Army Signals Corps, and I took a few years to do that, and then that got published, and they put a book launch. I love book launches. I'm a sucker for a good book launch, right? And so I get a real kick out of it. I get a kick out of being a master of a topic, and I get a kick out of the book launch, and I get a kick out of the opportunities that it presents as a result of that. So it's a combination of a degree of narcissism on my part, obsession, desire for excellence, and being nerdy. I can't quite nail down exactly which one I'd place more emphasis on, but thank you for the question.
I have heard that the humanitarian aspects of multiple countries can not mix with the intelligence or military aspects of the countries. Like, for example, like, I don't know if it's as accurate as I believe, but the people who work for FBI or the CIA can't work for humanitarian organizations anymore, is what I've heard. So, like, coming back to the topic, you said like the France, Australia, and other countries are like having humanitarian like deals right now. How much of that would impact later deals with relations to, let's say, military or technology aspects to it, and how positive are you in those, like, in the future?
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting because I think there are some administrative regulatory constraints about people who work for intelligence agencies in the US then going to work for, say, the Peace Corps. I think you're not allowed to do both. But in terms of the practice, as a former intelligence officer, the pinnacle experience for me was when I deployed as the brigade intelligence officer for a peacekeeping mission to East Timor in September 1999, a thing called Interfet, the International Force in East Timor. It was a UN mandated mission to go and restore order in East Timor after the crisis after the ballot and destruction of the country in August 1999. So we deployed with intelligence assets, and we deployed with the full suite of requirements to protect the force and to have insights and knowledge and understanding of the adversary and what their capabilities were and what their intentions were. So in this space, it's a little bit grey, but you can do humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and peacekeeping and still use intel. So as when I was J2 and working with good then Brigadier Gillian, now Professor Gillian, we had a series of disasters in the Pacific. So we actually needed the intelligence. We needed overflight. So we needed to send some planes, we needed satellite photos, we needed to listen to the SIGINT to see what was going on, to have a picture of what was going on in the ground, to then figure out how do we respond? What kind of humanitarian response package do you need? Do you put it on ships? Do you put it on aircraft? Are they going to go and be thrown out on parachutes? Are they going to be able to land safely? Is the runway clear? Are they going to be welcome when they get there? All of these questions need answers, and often they're provided through the intelligence system. So it's a bit of both, you know. You need intelligence to do peacekeeping, humanitarian work, but sometimes you have to air gap it a little bit from the folk who deploy and do the work. Great question, thank you.
I'm really sorry if you already mentioned this, but what brought you to the US?
So I was sitting in my corner of the ivory tower in ANU. Literally, it's an ivory-coloured tower building I have an office in. And I was minding my own business, supervising students and running my favourite course called Honeypots and Overcoats, Australian Intelligence in the World, right? It's a fun course. I like teaching it. And so I thought, I'm getting a bit long in the tooth, and I guess I'll stay here till, I fall off the perch. And then the Vice-Chancellor asked me if I knew anybody who'd be interested to come and run the office for the North America office for the university. And I said, oh, look, I know a couple of people who might be interested. They said, no, John, what about you? I said, oh, me? Oh, let me just check with my wife. And so we were just about to become empty nesters. And so she stayed for a bit to help that happen. And then I came a bit early, and we've been here ever since, working out of the office in Washington, DC. But basically riffing off my scholarship to talk up scholarship collaboration opportunities between Australia and North America, Canada and the US, which I'm hoping you're finding enticing.
I would love to introduce you to Nicole Clausen and get you to Australia as soon as possible. It would be a wonderful experience. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please join with me in thanking Professor Blaxland for sharing his expertise and his time with us tonight.
Thank you. Okay. Perfect.
Thank you and have a good evening.